It's always difficult to sort of take yourself so seriously that you actually have to narrate your own biography. But at the same time, it's very clear that it's impossible to separate the personal and the political. Um, but what often becomes interesting for me is that the personal becomes interesting not so as to collapse the political into it, but in fact to use the personal to illuminate the political. I mean that when your life is able to speak to larger issues, I think then your life might becomes interesting, and at least to others, hopefully. I mean, for me, I was a working class kid. I grew up in Providence, Rhode Island, and I grew up in a very tough neighborhood, actually. My early experiences are really marked by a kind of enormous division, and that is that I learned very quickly that your sense of agency was largely dependent upon physical matters, that you had to be able to defend yourself, you had to be able to talk fast, you had to be able to negotiate terrains in ways in which the knowledge that I got from school was never very helpful. So I immediately began to recognize that there was a relationship, although I couldn't theorize this at the time, between questions of context, the definition of oneself, the question of survival, and how one negotiated the world. And for me, it was a very interesting world because I grew up in a neighborhood that was consisted of lots of Irish, lots of Italians, and on the periphery, black neighborhoods. And the question of survival was always deeply embedded in our everyday lives. And we had to find ways to get money because we all were poor, actually terribly poor. So there was a sense, but there was also a sense in the midst of that poverty of modes of solidarity that marked me forever. If somebody got sick, the entire neighborhood would come out and help people out. They would cook, they would provide food, they would, if somebody went to the hospital, you knew people. I mean, there was a sense amidst the struggle of not just danger, but also a certain sense of solidarity, a certain sense of what it meant to become part of a collective. I never saw myself in the earlier parts of my life, and clearly this has had a profound effect on my life. I never saw myself as an isolated individual living, for instance, in a suburban space in which my connections to other people were relatively minor and incidental. Actually, I could not identify myself in the early parts of my life in that neighborhood outside of the context of the social, because the social both established constraints, offered contradictions, and spoke to possibilities that were so rigidly embedded in the contours of everyday life that it was impossible. You never went to school alone. You walked in groups, right? You didn't hang on a corner alone. You didn't engage in recreational facilities alone. There weren't tutors to come in to help you learn how to eventually take the GED, or whatever, the test that you needed to go to college. I mean, none of this happened. So you had to rely on each other, and that had a profound effect on me. What also had a profound effect on me was the fact that in the midst of learning how to survive, you also develop a certain sense of self-reliance. I mean, what it means to be in opposition to forces that clearly place constraints on you that ordinarily most people don't see. So the early part of my life was not frictionless, that's for sure. And when I went to high school, fortunately, I was a basketball player who received a scholarship. But because I never took the SATs, because I wasn't aware that I had to, I couldn't go to college. So I went to a junior college, and I dropped out of that, and then I worked for a couple of years in a bank and a variety of other jobs, and all of a sudden it dawned on me I had to go back. That there was no way I could endure counting money, and working under those circumstances. And so I did. So I went back. I got another scholarship. I went back. I went to a place now called the University of Southern Maine, graduated, got a scholarship to a place called Appalachian State University, which was in Boone, North Carolina. And at that time, during that period, my political consciousness was really beginning to emerge, because it was also, it's the 1960s. It was impossible in the 1960s not to be aware of what was going on in the outside world. People were really beginning to re-theorize what it meant to connect schooling to politics. Bose and Gintis had just written Schooling in Capitalist America, an enormously important book for many of us. Paulo Freire, of course, his work we had already known. Pedagogy of the Oppressed was an enormously important book because it linked education to social change, whereas Gintis linked education to questions of capitalism and exactly what that relationship did and what it meant. And the metaphor of schools as factories and schools as modes of social and cultural reproduction began to emerge and became dominant in the language. I was never comfortable with this language. I always felt that in some way it belied what I had seen in the neighborhoods in which I had grown up. I had never viewed workers as simply duped. I had never viewed students when I taught as simply passive. I had never viewed schools as simply prisons. In other words, the reproductive logic in a way struck me as an outgrowth of a kind of elitist ideology that never took seriously not only the contradictions in terms of the spaces that people occupy, but also the multiple ways in which people insert themselves in the world and how they mediate that. So I started writing about resistance, and I wrote a book at that time called Theory and Resistance in Education. And that book I think had an enormous influence in the field, although the field was dominated by a group of Marxists at the time that refused to publish it. Routledge was the dominant publisher, and I somehow got excluded from this group. In growing up as a working class kid, the first battle that you really have to fight is that you're always defined by a lack. You're not defined by the strengths you have. You're always defined by what you don't have. You're defined by the fact that you don't talk in the elaborated code. You're defined by the fact that you use double negatives. You're defined by the fact that you don't really write as well as kids who are trained in local elite prep schools. You're defined by the fact that you don't look as if you dress in a way that suggests you fit comfortably in the country club or the golf course. So you have to begin to sort of theorize these tensions and what it would mean within a community that is largely middle class, how you would define yourself as an academic. So to speed forward a bit. So here I am at BU, sort of with Howard carrying around this legacy, writing this work, trying to negotiate the university. But I was still laboring under something that was quite false. And I was laboring under the assumption that if you did your work and you wrote and you published, then you would get tenure. And that's how it worked. That this was a liberal institution. This was the 1977 to 1981. But at the time, Boston University had a new president, a guy named John Sober. And John Sober was a different kind of reactionary. He was an engaged reactionary. He didn't hide in the shadows and make decisions that crippled people's lives. He boasted about it. I mean, he made it very clear that people on the left were not going to get tenure at BU, the feminists, the people who did Frankfurt School theory, the people who, did Holocaust, I mean, it was endless, right? Endless. And so I came up for tenure, went through the process unanimously at every level, and all of a sudden I was denied. I was denied tenure. And I guess the point of that story is that what I learned is that not only is the university an intense site of struggle, but to presuppose for one moment that politics is trumped by virtue of intellectual production, by virtue of playing the rules of the game, I found entirely false. And I think that those sets of experience politicized me more than probably any other experience I had. I mean, it was very clear to me that in these positions, you fight for what you believe in. Hopefully you do it collectively, and you're more protected. But that, it's a difficult journey. And for me, it raises questions, of course, about upcoming generations of young people who increasingly have to face conditions that are even, I think, worse than they were when I began. That's for sure. I mean, tenure is now being considered a luxury. In the United States, only 30% of the people in the faculty had tenure, full-time positions that I could no longer support. That I could no longer live in a country that in many ways was becoming, not Nazi Germany, I think that's nonsense, but was inventing a mode of authoritarianism that in many ways was increasingly as dangerous, particularly to the issue of democracy. I mean, this is not a romanticized story about my experiences. I mean, I think this is a story that suggests and has implications for experiences that hundreds of people go through, who have the courage to believe that education has something to do with taking risk, that in fact authority should be held accountable, that we should push the envelope around questions of social justice, that societies should be seen as never just enough, and that intellectuals have responsibilities, to say the very least, not just simply to produce knowledge, but in some ways do what they can to expand and deepen the possibilities of democracy itself.